week. And now I would like to welcome our speaker. Dr. Gleb is an internationally renowned thought leader in future proofing. His specialties in helping forward-looking leaders secure their organization's future by forecasting and addressing threats and maximizing opportunities. He serves as the CEO of the future-proofing consultancy Disaster Avoidance Experts. A best-selling author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is most well known for his 2019 bestseller, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press, and his 2020 best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, published by New Harbinger. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. They include USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS News, Fortune, Inc. Magazine, CNBC, and many more. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years of academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. To help you take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, he's here to share how government meeting planners successfully adapt to COVID and plan for the post-COVID recovery. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gleb.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Really appreciate it. Well, everyone, I hope you're ready for COVID to be over. I know I am, but unfortunately, it'll still take some time and the recovery will not be as simple and easy as it seems. So I'll talk today, my presentation will focus on what we know now. Of course, I did a previous version of this at the virtual conference for SGMP last year, and that was very well received, which is why I'm doing an update on what's going on with COVID right now and what you have to be thinking about as meeting planners, as government meeting planners, going into the future as informed by the current status of COVID. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be focusing first on the structure of what we know now, things like vaccines, things like the new strains, what it means for meeting planners, how you should be doing things differently if you decide that you should be doing things differently based on this information, and then just on the decision-making errors that we tend to make around COVID so that to inform your post-COVID recovery, your work on the post-COVID recovery. So that's what we'll be focusing on. That's the shape of the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's going on now with major in-person events. And I know this is not only, I'm going to be talking about huge events, not simply government events. Obviously, we just had the inauguration, but that's not the kind of typical event that we're talking about right now. I know that the Department of Defense, for example, is having a conference where they just ordered a bunch of my books, 120 copies of my books, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, for their conference that's coming up in February. So they have at least 120 people there. I'm not sure about all the details. So that's one example of a government agency that has a meeting coming up. Now, there are many examples of large, huge meetings that are coming up with many thousands of people. So for example, the Heli Expo, the International Association for Helicopters, is having one in New Orleans on March 22nd to 25th. So that's scheduled, all booked and so on, having a huge major event. Then the National Restaurant Association show, again, many thousands of people, is going to be in May 22nd to 25th in Chicago. And then Natural Products Expo West, again, major products for natural things, all that sort of stuff, will also be having one in Anaheim, California on May 24th to 27th. So just to give you a sense of reference, what's going on right now. Now I want to mention that the Code Conference, you've probably heard about the technology takes COVID especially seriously. And Code Conference is one of the biggest conferences in the technology sector. And they will have a conference on June 1st to 3rd in Beverly Hills. Again, all of these are in-person conferences, fully in person, not hybrid. So I want to ask you, what's your timeline for events with people over 100 attendees? And I will give you a poll. So you'll see a poll right now, a polling option on Zoom. So just click on the poll, indicate which of these you're willing to hold events. Second quarter of 2021, third quarter, fourth quarter, first quarter, or 2022 or later. So please go ahead. Okay, so far we have around 66% of the people voted, and the first quarter of 2022 is winning out a little bit. Let's get a little bit more people. Make sure we all have a chance to make their voice heard. See, 84% of the people voted. I'll give you 5 more seconds to make your voice heard. All right. So let's take a look at the results. So we see that for the second quarter of 2021, we have about a fifth, another fifth for the third quarter, another fifth for the fourth quarter, and then just in 2022, we have another two fifths, one about just over 25% in the first quarter of 2022, and just over 10% for the second quarter of 2022 or later. So that's good to know. So here, this will be a baseline that we'll be using throughout the presentation. I'll take another poll similar to this one at the end to see if you in any way shifted your perspective after this presentation. So we'll know that this is approximately the breakdown, around 20%, 20%, 20%, just over 25%, and just over 10%. Great. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the vaccines. That's going to be the first thing. The first, I want to share some great news. The Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines have proven to be highly effective and safe, very highly effective, very highly safe. If you were present at my previous presentation, the closing keynote of the SGMP virtual conference, annual conference, which became virtual last year, you'll have recalled that I talked about, hey, pretty low likelihood of highly effective and safe initial vaccines, the first wave of vaccines. So the traditional vaccines, for example, AstraZeneca is producing the vaccines more of the traditional way, and their vaccines are around 62% effective or something like that. Low 60s, that's their effectiveness. So not very effective, but this new technology has proven to be much better than I anticipated. So I'm very, very glad that it's in the more positive range of my predictions. I said there's something like a 25% chance, only a 25% chance that we'll have a highly safe and effective vaccine by the beginning of this year. And we are very fortunate to be living in that optimistic world, the higher 25% chance of all possible worlds with a highly effective and safe vaccines. 2 vaccines. So Pfizer and Moderna. We're very lucky, and we should consider ourselves fortunate and blessed, and whatever value system you have, to be grateful for whatever happened that caused us to be in this very wonderful and positive world. So that's wonderful news, great news. It's over 90% effective. Side effects are relatively minimal. It's some experience flu-like symptoms for 2 to 3 days, especially as a result of the second shot. So these are 2-shot vaccines. Most of the current vaccines are 2-shot. The AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna, they're all 2-shot vaccines. The AstraZeneca is not available in the United States. It hasn't been approved yet, so I don't know if it will be approved. But the Pfizer and Moderna are what we have available here, and they're highly effective. So again, some side effects, especially after the second shot. And you should keep in mind, so the way the side effects work, the way the vaccines work, is that they're made to create side effects. They're made to train your body to respond to fragments of the virus. Now, there is no actual live virus or dead virus in the Pfizer or Moderna. What they did using mRNA technology is they produced pieces of the vaccine, specifically this, you've probably heard about the spike protein on the COVID-19. They produced the spike protein that then your immune system responds to. So the flu-like symptoms that you experience and the folks experience are the responses. That's your immune system responding. So it's a good thing if you feel flu-like symptoms. If you don't feel anything completely no response after the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, you might be in that 10% of people for whom it's not effective. So you got to be a little bit more careful if you don't feel any side effects from the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. You want to feel side effects. Side effects are a good thing. They're an indication that your body is working to address COVID. So that's what you want to realize. Now, there are some people who should not be taking the vaccines, and that's people who have very sensitive allergies. Or let me say it this way. If you do take the vaccine, you want to bring your EpiPen with you. I mean, you know who you are. If you carry an EpiPen with you, you want to make sure to bring it with you if you decide to get the vaccine, and then stay there for quite a while for observation, just in case, stay there for at least an hour. Most people stay for 15 minutes. So that's you. But the large majority, and there are some autoimmune deficiency syndromes, which make it, you might be careful before taking the vaccine to consult with your doctor. But the vast majority of us, that's great. You want to take the vaccine. And you should encourage others to do so, because the more people get the vaccine, the more we move toward herd immunity, which is what we really need in order to hold large events. But I will talk about that in just a bit. Now, there are some bad news, unfortunately, on the vaccines, and they come from two fronts. So we talked about the great news. We have it available. It's great. It's very effective. It's wonderful. There are some problems. It's hard to ship and store. This is a big problem. It is really hard to ship and store. The Moderna requires -4 Fahrenheit and the Pfizer -76 Fahrenheit storage, especially if Pfizer, that's extra cold. Moderna is cold. It's not out of the range of most refrigerators, freezers, I'm sorry, but it's still not the best. Pfizer is especially bad. It's only, you need major industrial refrigerators, cold storage for that. You've probably heard about ultra cold storage. So the rollout is extremely delayed, partially for this reason, partially for various miscommunications, apparently, if you look at the reports between the federal government and the central government, lack of funding from the federal government to local state governments, not very good coordination with the federal government and state governments. So there's a lot of problems that are causing delays, very, very serious delays in the rollout. It's much slower than promised, anticipated by the federal government. So for example, in December 2020, the federal government promised that 20 million people would be vaccinated. That means 40 million shots, so 2 shots per person, would go out, and then people would be vaccinated with 2 doses by that time. That means 40 million doses in people's arms by that time. Reality is only under 3 million people were vaccinated. Only under 3 million. So that's not a good pace. The current rate is under 1 million a day. Under 1 million a day, which, that's really a very, very slow pace for the size of the country that we are, and the amount of vaccine doses that are being produced by Moderna and Pfizer and shipped to us. They're just not getting to where they need to get efficiently. So this is bad news. Another piece of quite bad news is vaccine acceptance. There's serious vaccine hesitancy among folks. A lot of misinformation about vaccines. For example, some people are saying that, well, these side effects are indicative that I have COVID. That's, of course, not the case. That's not true. Side effects that you have are indication that your immune system is working. It's responding to the vaccine as it should. But a lot of misinformation from people who are skeptical of modern science is leading to vaccine hesitancy, including many people who are working in high-profile positions, the first people who are getting vaccines. 1/3 of medical workers in New York and Michigan and elsewhere are refusing to get the vaccine. And these are medical workers. These are professionally trained folks. These are doctors, these are nurses. It's pretty terrible. But even worse is the situation in nursing homes. 2/3 of the workers in nursing homes in Ohio, North Carolina, and other states are refusing to get vaccinated. That's pretty bad. These are people who see COVID ripping through their ranks of their elderly patients, and they're refusing to get vaccinated. That does not bode well for general acceptance of vaccines, because in order to get to herd immunity, you've probably herd immunity, we need up to 85% of the population vaccinated or otherwise immune to get to herd immunity. So that's a big, big problem. It might be a little bit less, maybe 80%, but up to 85% is the scientific estimate. So we better go for the more conservative number. So 85% of the population, given that 2/3 of the nursing home workers who've seen their patients suffer so much aren't getting the vaccine, 1/3 of doctors and nurses aren't getting the vaccine. This is not good. So we need to lift restrictions, and that's where we get to herd immunity. In order to lift restrictions, that's where we need to get to herd immunity. In order for people to not wear masks, in order for people to not do social distancing, that's what larger events will require, because if you've probably seen and heard from potential attendees at your events that they don't want to go to events with masks. They don't want to go to events with social distancing. They want to go back to what things previously were. And to get to that, we need to get to herd immunity. And that is going to be very difficult given the vaccine hesitancy and the vaccine skepticism. All right. So given this information, both the positive information and the negative information, let's take a look at another poll. How has this update on vaccines influenced your timeline on willingness to hold events with over 100 attendees? So compared to how you were previously thinking, were you more likely to hold such events earlier, hasn't changed, or more likely to delay such events? Please go ahead and vote. We have some positive news and some negative news. And what is the balance overall on how this impacts your willingness to hold these sorts of large events? I see about 70% of the people voted. Good, so we're up to 75. Let's give folks 5 more seconds to make their voice heard. All right. Okay, so we see that 14% of the people are more likely to hold events earlier. About 3/5, so 58% haven't changed their minds, but 28% are more likely to delay such events. So about literally double the number who are more likely to hold such events earlier. So a little bit shifting of the timelines for people who voted first. Good to know. So overall, the balance is somewhat of a delay among the audience here. All right. Let's go on to talk about something that's pretty problematic, these new COVID strains. You've probably been hearing about them on the news, and this actually is something to really pay a lot of serious attention to. It's more problematic than many media outlets make it out to be, because our tracking of COVID strains is very limited. We're doing very poorly on genetic sequencing of these strains. The UK has uploaded, with a population of around 60-ish million, it has sequenced over 100,000 strains. And in the US, with a population of 330 million, we've sequenced something like 50,000 strains. So much less, very slow pace of genetic sequencing of these strains. So this is very problematic. So we are not tracking them well. The UK and South Africa strains, according to expert scientists, likely got here by mid-November. And that's when they likely landed here. You've probably been hearing about these strains, the UK strains, the South Africa strains. When they got here, they have already been found in something like 12 states, as I was checking the headlines earlier today. And they've been found in many people without a history of travel. That means, of course, that there's community spread, widespread community spread, but because of our lack of good genetic sequencing, good genetic tracking, we are just not aware of this. So this is a big problem. You should assume pretty safely that wherever you are, there's very likely to be the new strains around where you are. And in fact, they might not be the exact UK and South Africa strains. So for example, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So go Bucks, home of the Buckeyes. And Ohio State University study published about 7 days ago, about a week ago, found that there is a new strain that seems to have originated in the US that's pretty similar to the UK strain in terms of the shape of the mutations. And for context, these mutations, COVID mutations, appear all the time. We have many thousands of strains. The problematic thing is when parts of the virus mutate that make it more impactful, whether more infectious, more deadly, more able to escape the vaccines. And so the UK and the South Africa strains are problematic in that regard. And so the new strain that originated here in the US and was determined to be here in Columbus, Ohio, by my university, Ohio State University, where I spent 7 years as a professor. It found that this new strain is pretty similar to the UK strain and as highly infectious, just like the UK strain. And it came to dominate the central Ohio area over a period of 3 weeks, from early December through mid-January. So pretty clearly, we have other strains beside these, but that are coming up, and they are highly problematic. So there are probably many thousands of cases across multiple states by now. And that's a big problem. Why? Well, first of all, let's talk about some of the good news. So not going into the bad news right away. Some good news first. The vaccines seem to be mostly effective against the new strains. They seem to be more effective against the UK strain than the South Africa strain, but overall they are pretty effective. They're at worst, they're 70% effective. So going from 90% effectiveness to 70% effectiveness against the South Africa strain. So mostly effective, and companies can update their vaccination formulas and give booster shots in case we want to get that vaccine ability from 70% back up to 90%. And the mRNA vaccines especially can be updated pretty quickly just because of this new technology, which is a scientific wonder. So we need to be really grateful to the scientists who came up with these new vaccines. So that's very nice and important. Fortunately, the new COVID strains aren't more deadly. That's good news. So we have good news that they're mostly vulnerable to the vaccines, somewhat less vulnerable, but mostly vulnerable to the vaccines. And they're also not more deadly. They do create a higher viral load. But with the higher viral load, they have similar medical outcomes. So the higher viral load of COVID doesn't lead to worse medical outcomes. Here's what it leads to, and here's the big danger. It leads to more infectiousness. So the UK strain, we know from research, is 56 to 70% more infectious. So various studies show anywhere between 56 to 70% more infectious compared to the COVID strain that was widespread in the US, UK, and elsewhere before that. Each individual, that means, infects 56 to 70% more people on average. If you're into the science of it, it's the R number, the rate of infection. So if R1 means that you're maintaining the infection, this would make it jump to R 1.56 to 1.7, which would mean much greater increase in infectiousness. The South African strain appears to be even more dangerous. And of course, it appears to be less vulnerable to our vaccine. So that's even more dangerous. Now, in the South Africa, so this is in South Africa, just be clarifying, this is not in the UK, and this is not in the US. It was initially found in October and caused over 80% of new cases by the end of December. So in 2 to 3 months, it took over, it became predominant. In the UK, there was a similar timeline. Over 6 to 8 weeks, it became predominant. And of course, here in Columbus, Ohio, in this area, the UK-like strain became predominant over 3 weeks. Of course, this is a much smaller territory than a whole country. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some bad news, some real problems for these strains. What we find, what we saw, what we're seeing already in the UK and South Africa, and now other countries where these new strains have been exported to, like Ireland and Denmark, is that they cause double the number of infections from the previous infection rate every 2 weeks. So the infections double every 2 weeks. This is very, very scary. This is very, very bad. The UK and South Africa, as a result, had major case surges, and we're seeing more major case surges in Ireland and Denmark and elsewhere where these strains are becoming more predominant, 2 to 3 months after the new strains were discovered. And so the US can expect a case surge by April 2021. That's when we can expect a case surge. And in fact, there was a recent study by the CDC that came out 6 days ago that said that according to its calculations, March might be as early as March. So I'm giving you a little bit more of a conservative timeline, April 2021. By April 2021, that includes March, of course, but the CDC said as early as March, we can expect a major, major rise in these cases because the new strain becomes dominant. The new strains from the UK and South Africa, especially the UK one, is most present here in the US. So what does that mean? That means very bad news. Very, very bad news. I'm very sad to hear about these news. It's pretty terrible. When I was first researching this, and so I sent white paper to the SGMP National about this. It's which I wrote up at the end of December when I first looked at the new strains and their implications for the US. It's very bad. It's much more problematic that there's a higher infectiousness than if they were, 56% more infectious is much worse in terms of medical outcomes than 56% more deadliness. And here's why. So the US case daily count from December 10th to 24th was just over 200,000. And I'm comparing that to, we had that mostly stable until, until the Christmas bump, New Year bump. But think about what happens once it starts doubling. So what happens then? 400,000 cases per day in 2 weeks, from 200,000 to 400,000. That's what a doubling means. That's what happened in the UK and South Africa. So that's what doubling means. Then 800,000 cases per day in 4 weeks, and 1.6 million cases per day in 6 weeks. That's how doubling works. This is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly bad. Unfortunately, this is very dangerous and very problematic. And you might think, won't someone do something? Well, unfortunately, it's not going to be so easy. There was a case bump that's right now caused by Christmas and New Year's that hides the greater infectiousness of the new strains. So for example, it went from 200,000. We were maintaining at 200,000 in the middle of December. Now, most recently in the US, the average has been 240 to 150,000 cases per day. And that's the case bump caused by Christmas and New Year, but it's hiding the greater infectiousness of these new strains. Health officials are overwhelmingly focused on vaccines. Are the vaccines going to be effective against the new strains? But only about 25% of Americans will be vaccinated by April. And if the CDC is right and it happens in March, it'll be even less, something like maybe 15-ish% of Americans will be vaccinated by April. Governors are very reluctant to impose lockdowns. You've seen this. There's extreme politicization of lockdowns, extreme protests, lots and lots of problems. Right now, a number of governors are going the other way. They're lifting restrictions. So North Dakota, for example, recently lifted its mask mandate. A number of other states are lifting restrictions on restaurants and bars and so on. So there's lifting of restrictions at a time when the new strain is becoming more and more widespread. This is very bad and not the wisest policy, but this is what's happening. Many people, furthermore, don't comply with restrictions. I mean, California, let's look at California. California in December, when there was the spike in California, imposed some pretty strict restrictions, and a lot of people followed them, but a lot of people didn't, and caused a lot of conflict, a lot of problems. And California is still suffering pretty badly. What we know now about some of the reasons for wide suffering, well, the new strains, though, have been found in largest numbers in California. So it's likely that at least some of the California rise in cases is coming from these new strains, the higher infectiousness of these new strains. So this is pretty dangerous and this is pretty problematic. And this is hard to hear. Like I said, when I was first researching this, it was in late December, I was getting pretty depressed and I was getting, very, very sad. And it was hard information for me to hear. And so, as someone who manages risks myself, I deal with this stuff all the time. And I was really hoping, it came just after the nice news about the vaccines, the wonderful news about the vaccines that they're getting shipped, getting delivered, and then seeing this new strains and the real danger they presented was really, really bad. And so this was really difficult for my clients to accept. My training, coaching, and consulting clients, I was talking to a number of them, telling them, like I said, I sent a white paper to Garland at SGMP, Director of Education, and so on. Other clients, it's hard to accept this information. It's unpleasant, it's difficult, but it will be really more painful in the long term if we don't accept and adapt to this reality. Because the reality is really bad. I mean, think about what happens when you go from 200,000 cases to 400,000 in 2 weeks, 400,000 to 800,000 in 4 weeks, then from 800,000 to 1.6 million in 6 weeks. I mean, our hospitals are already overloaded, very overloaded in a number of states, not all states. Here in Columbus, Ohio, it's still okay, but in Alabama, California, a number of other states, they're doing pretty bad. And they're refusing some patients, turning some patients away. Now, of course, when you go from 200,000 to 400,000, those people will end up in hospitals in a couple of weeks, the people who picked up COVID. What happens when their intake literally doubles of COVID patients? That's going to be going from overwhelmed to broken. It's just they're not going to be able to accept patients. And we know that the fatality rates shoots up very highly when patients aren't able to get hospital treatment, as happened in New York City in March, and as happened in northern Italy, when the fatality rate shot up from something like 0.5 to 0.1%, it varies between those, to something like 10%. So this is really, really dangerous. And this is something that we're going to be facing in April, May, maybe as early as March. Well, March probably for becoming predominant caseload, then hospitalizations in maybe April, May, June, until we get widespread vaccination, which, given the slow pace of the rollout right now, we have to not be very optimistic about it. Say it's maybe something by the end of the summer, we'll have widespread vaccination. And we'll still have a lot of people who are opposed to vaccines, so we won't have herd immunity by that time. So that's something to really think about with you as meeting planners planning your events. Now, with this unfortunate information about the new strains, I want to ask you another poll. How has this update on the new COVID strains impacted your willingness and timelines to hold events with 100+ attendees? Please go ahead. So I see about 60% of the people voted. Good. Let's get some more. Okay, we're at 70%. I'll give folks 5 more seconds to make your voice heard. All right. Okay, so we see that overwhelmingly it caused folks to be more likely to delay their events. So about just under 2/3, 1/3 will not change, but 2/3 will delay your events to later. Good to know, and good to see what your colleagues are thinking about given this information and evidence. All right, now it's hard for us to make good decisions around COVID, and there's a reason that folks struggle to accept this new reality because of dangerous judgment errors that come from our intuitive decision making around COVID-19. And this is something, as you're thinking about holding events and making plans in the post-COVID recovery, you want to be aware of these dangerous judgment errors and try to make sure that you don't fall into them. We make bad decisions about threats that are unusual or slow moving, like these new COVID strains. They're unusual, obviously. They're weird. They're not what we're used to. They're slow moving. Doubling every 2 weeks is relatively slow moving, but it has a huge impact. Our brain is wired to not pay good attention to such threats because we underestimate them. That's what our gut reaction is. It underestimates these dangerous these threats because of how our brain is wired. And that leads to decisions that endanger your work as government meeting planners. So that's something for you to be thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about why. Well, we as human beings suffer from mental blind spots called dangerous judgment errors. Cognitive biases is the technical term for this. So you can look it up on Wikipedia. There's over 100 of them. I'll send you some resources after the presentation for the most dangerous ones that you need to be aware of. So that's something that you'll get after the presentation. So don't worry about it right now, but going on Wikipedia, but there's over 100 of them that we need to understand. That's the behavioral science, the neuroscience, and behavioral economics of how we make bad decisions as people. And they come from our evolutionary background. We are not evolved for the modern world. I mean, think about the modern world, the internet, right? We're connecting with over 100 of you across virtual time and space. We're not wired for this world. The internet has only been around since 1990. But our evolutionary responses, our gut reactions, our instincts, what we're comfortable with, what intuitively feels like the right decisions, they're wired for the savanna environment when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. And so our brains process data as though we are still in that environment, and we have to deliberately go against our intuitions to make good decisions. For example, our main response to threats like these new COVID strains is the fight or flight response. And the original pandemic, we did not make good decisions on that either. The fight or flight response to threats was great for hunter-gatherers. It was life-saving for them because the risks they faced were immediate, intense, in the moment. They're like saber-toothed tigers. That's the kind of risks they faced, but we don't. In today's world, this is much more dangerous. The risks we face are long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They might come from a notification on your smartphone about someone forwarding you a white paper about these new COVID strains, or an article, or the CDC study that came out that said that they'll become predominant in March. I don't know if you saw the headlines on that, but that really wasn't in the headlines because it's been obscured, of course, by the inauguration and all the stuff that's happening. And this information is getting hidden because that's not what draws clicks. That's not what draws attention. What draws clicks from the media is stuff about, I mean, deservedly, of course, some of these huge national conflicts, but the mainstream media should also very much be covering these new strains, and it doesn't. And that's very unfortunate. There are 3 specific dangerous judgment errors that I want you to pay attention to, and I want you to be thinking about as we're going into the post-COVID recovery so that you don't make these mistakes. The normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. The normalcy bias. So our gut reactions, our intuitions, is to feel that the future will be the same, much the same as today. That was a pretty safe assumption in the savanna environment. Main change would be changes of the seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. But that's not a safe assumption in today's environment. So the intuition, for example, let's take the new COVID strains, is to feel like the previous way of behaving with COVID and the previous intuitions, the previous decision-making is the right one to go forward, because we're used to it. We've lived in the pandemic for over 9 months already, right? So we're not used to a situation where it's now much, much, much easier to catch COVID. If it's 70% more infectious, think about that. Instead of 15 minutes with someone that right now the CDC has guidelines saying if you spend over 15 minutes with someone who has COVID, you need to go into quarantine. What does 70% more infectious mean? That means that it's going to be under half that time. Really, the guidelines should now be 6 minutes as the new strains are becoming predominant. But of course, this hasn't changed. That's what 70% more infectious means. So that's an example. That's the same thing as how do you go shopping to stores? How do you do all of your interactions with others? These are much more dangerous times, but that's not what we feel like. And we forecast the short-term future based on the short-term past. And we underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptors like these new strains. The planning fallacy, related bias, where we look at our plans and we feel that everything is going to go according to plan. We feel good about ourselves. We feel good about our plans. So we make the plan, we go forward with it. And we don't shift it in a nearly timely enough manner. We don't think about all the risks, all the problems that can come. And that's a big problem. We underestimate the resources we need of time, money, information, social capital, whatever resources. And finally, hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting is about undercounting the importance of the future. We focus on the short term. In the Savannah environment, this made a lot of sense. It was going to be very hard for folks to plan into the long term. You can't save resources for the long term. You can't make a long-term plan. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. You need to live for today, preserve resources. But right now, we can make a plan. We can see the clear trend lines going from now, thousands of cases now to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, by March, by April, something like that. And we underestimate these outcomes. We prioritize the short term to the detriment and harm of the long term. And that, of course, is especially dangerous for you as meeting planners because you have long-term timelines. We underestimate these long-term outcomes and impacts. So these are the 3 dangerous judgment errors that I want you to be aware of. And so let's take a look at the poll. Which of these 3 cognitive biases do you think is most impactful in your workplace? Normalcy bias, planning fallacy, or hyperbolic discounting? See, about 60% of the people voted. So let's, come on, give everyone a chance to vote. I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right. So overwhelmingly, it seems that normalcy bias for most of you is the biggest problem. So normalcy bias for over half of you, then hyperbolic discount, then planning fallacy for a third of you, and then hyperbolic discounting for just under 15%. So that's for you to know about and for you to think about this information as you're going into the post-COVID recovery and planning and preparing for that. Which are these dangerous judgment errors are most relevant to you and how do you avoid them as you're going into this recovery? All right, so we're coming up to the conclusion. I want to tell you about being prepared for the world changing forever. You just need to be ready for the world to change forever because it's, even as part of the post-COVID recovery, we'll still change our habits, values, desires, behaviors. People will not be coming to conferences in the same way. People will still want a lot of virtual interactions. People will have a lot of anxiety around going to conferences, around interacting with people. That is something that you have to be thinking about. A lot of people don't want to go to conferences with masks and social distancing. When will we get to herd immunity? I'm not sure at all we'll get to it by the end of the year, given the slow pace of vaccination and a lot of skepticism among people who should not be skeptical, like medical workers and nursing home workers. We'll never go back to that January 2020. And if we don't get to herd immunity, it might be pretty dangerous for you to hold a conference that does not have masks and social distancing. So that's something for you to be very, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, but that's something for you to be very seriously thinking about. How do you balance these sorts of things? You want to hope for the best. You can hope for herd immunity by the end of 2021. I would love for that to be the case, but you got to prepare for the worst. You got to plan for the worst. Too many event professionals, they act as though the problem will blow over soon. Told you about the major conferences going on in March, May, June. I think that's silly. I mean, honestly, those conferences are going to be happening at the time when the new COVID strains are going to cause huge hospital overload. That is not a good time to hold a major conference. Hope is not a strategy, which is a great quote attributed to Vince Lombardi. And so I want you to not ignore the new COVID strains. Think about it and think about how it will shift your planning going forward. So let's take a look at the poll. What's your current timeline on your willingness to hold events with over 100 attendees? So we remember the previous one, we had a breakdown of 20% for the first quarter of 2021, 20% for the third quarter, 20% for the fourth quarter. Then we had around 28% for the first quarter of 2022 and 12% for the second quarter of 2022 or later. All right, we see about 70% of the people voted. Let's give folks 5 more seconds to vote. All right, so we see a clear shift. We see that just over 10% will still hold them in the second quarter of 2021, under 10% in the third quarter, 15% in the fourth quarter, and then definitely a shift to 60% of you will hold them, a third of you will hold them in the first quarter of 2021, and a third of you in the second quarter of 2022 or later. So that last number went from 12% to 33%, and generally clear shift to later. So this is unfortunately the new reality in which we live. And this is something that you need to be really thinking about. This is not as optimistic as I hoped it would be. You know, when I was first organizing this with Emily and Garland, I was really hoping that would be very optimistic conversation about the vaccines and how they made the situation so much better. But these new COVID strains are making it much more difficult. All right. As I promised, free resources that are going to be available to you. So free additional resources, we'll do a polling on them. There'll be a white paper with in-depth research on the implications of the new COVID strains. So that'll be something that you can look into, use yourself, share with your colleagues, share with your vendors who are going to be complaining about you delaying the conference that you plan to hold, the vendors, the sponsors, the leaders in your organizations, whoever they are, who are, again, pushing you to hold things earlier. There's going to be a manual for failure proofing on major projects, which is going to be a technique that you can use to help yourself make decisions about the post-COVID recovery and how to hold meetings effectively. And a digital copy of my new best-selling book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, which is a whole thorough strategic approach to the last wave of COVID that we'll clearly see, unfortunately, the surge, and how they get into the post-COVID recovery effectively. All right, so let's take a look at the poll. Please vote on whether you would like to get post-training resources from me as the presenter. If you are dialing in by the phone and you are unable to vote on this poll, please, as part of sending your information to Emily, indicate that you would like to get resources from me, and then Emily will forward me your information and I'll send you the resources. So that's going to be for people who are dialing in and are unable to vote. All right, I'll be happy to take questions right now. So happy to take questions, any questions that you wish.
Yes, Dr. Gleb, as the virus modifies and mutates, will we need to take additional virus vaccines, shots, boosters, that type of thing? Will it be something that we have
Yes.
to take every year?
We will have to take them as the virus mutates. So I mentioned that the mRNA vaccines can create pretty quick booster shots. So yes, you can anticipate that as the virus mutates, based on random statistics, based on random chance, sometimes, for example, for the UK strain, right, you wouldn't have to take a booster for the UK strain, it appears. It appears that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are fully effective against it. But you definitely need to take a booster against the South Africa strain, because it appears that the Pfizer and Moderna are only 70% effective against the 90% effectiveness. And that's not something you want to roll the dice on. So yes, we will have to take booster shots over time.
Okay, we have quite a few questions on mask.
Yep.
Will the N95 mask be the only effective solution for the new strains?
All of the masks are effective, but it depends on the amount of time you spend. So if you're going to have a clothing mask, it's going to protect you for a short period of time. If you're going to have a surgical mask, it will protect you for a slightly longer period of time. If you will have an N95 mask, it will protect you for a longer period of time. But remember, N95 means it filters about 95% of particles. A clothing mask maybe filters about 50-ish% of particles. A surgical mask maybe filters about 70% of particles. So it all depends on the amount of time that you have exposed to people with COVID. And especially with these new strains, which it's much easier to catch because of the much higher viral load. So again, the CDC should really, as the new strains become dominant, decrease the amount of time from 15 minutes to something like 6 minutes that you can spend in contact with someone before you need to go into quarantine. So that would be my answer about the masks.
Okay, would you recommend double masking?
Yes, I would recommend double masking. That definitely increases the filtering capacity of the masks. At some point, you are just not going to be able to breathe effectively through the mask. That's why an N95 mask has usually a filter through which you breathe. So double masking is going to protect you for a longer period of time than a single mask. But again, by the time you get to 3 or 4 masks, it's just going to be too hard to breathe.
Right. Do you have any feelings on, once we get into warmer weather, is this going to slow down the virus, or are the strains going to be immune to that and move forward?
Well, the main reason it will slow it down is that people will be spending more time outside. So the more time people spend time outside, like we had this summer, the less problems we'll have, because it's harder to get infected outside. The problem is that the virus gets into you through through small water droplets and large water droplets that come as a result of people breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing, and so on. And so they hang around indoors. Outdoors, they're dispersed by the air. So it's something like about 1/20th of the probability of getting infected outdoors as you have indoors. So that's great for outdoors. And that's why you'll want to definitely spend as much time outdoors as possible interacting with people.
Are filters on mask really that effective? Is that basically the same as double masking, or?
Okay, so you're asking about filters and masks. So N95 has a filter through which you breathe out. That's what the filter is. So the point of the filter is to make it easier for you to breathe. And so it doesn't make the mask more effective. It still has 95% effectiveness, but it just makes it easier for you to breathe. Now, when you're having a conference, that's a separate dimension. You don't want to allow people to have N95 masks, because if they breathe out and they have COVID, that's like they have no mask at all. They're not protecting. I mean, unless everybody has an N95 mask and everybody is in that space, if you have an N95 mask, you are not protecting anyone else but yourself. So just be very clear on that. So N95 mask means you're only protecting yourself. If the N95 mask has a filter, which most N95 masks do.
Another question, if someone is allergic to penicillin, does that cause a problem with getting the vaccine?
I don't believe that penicillin is a problem. If you're not carrying an EpiPen, then you should not have problems with the vaccine. I'd recommend that you spend the usual recommended amount of time to spend there is 15 minutes. You probably want to spend more, like 30 minutes there to make sure that there's no problem. But generally speaking, unless you're carrying an EpiPen, unless your allergy is that bad, you should not worry about it.
Okay. If someone has had COVID-19 and recovered, do they still need to get the vaccine?
Yes, you should still get the vaccine because the antibodies fade from COVID. So we know that they fade over time. And so the vaccine will improve the antibodies that you have. So you definitely want to get the vaccine.
Okay. And if someone has had COVID and they are no longer contagious after 2 weeks, do you still have to worry about contracting from them, or what is the period there?
If they had COVID and their symptoms faded, yeah, after 2 weeks, that they should not, there shouldn't be a worry. If they're, of course, one of the COVID long haulers, then that's a problem. So you want the symptoms completely to fade, absolutely zero symptoms, no fatigue, no coughing, no fever, no temperature, no brain fog, all symptoms to fade. Because if you have continuing symptoms, it might indicate that there's still some COVID left in your body. So just keep that in mind.
What are some of the side effects that people can experience from the vaccine?
Or anything that you would experience from COVID, because that's your immune system fighting the large majority of symptoms you experience from COVID is your immune system fighting it. So things like fever, things like ache, things like fatigue, things like coughing. Fatigue is quite commonly experienced. Ache in the body pains all over your body, especially where the shot was given. So especially after the second shot, you want to be ready to take the day off work, because some people have reported those moderate symptoms that, I mean, essentially think like you're having what would you do if you have moderate-ish flu or even severe flu? You're gonna lie in bed all day, right? Or something like that, So that's what you got to be prepared for, especially after the second shot. And those are the side effects, and they are an indication that the vaccine is working. It's retraining your body to respond to COVID. That's the point of the vaccine, to train your body to respond to COVID. So it's an indication that the vaccine is working. You got to be worried if you have no side effects. That means that you might be in that 10-ish% of people for whom the vaccine is ineffective.
Okay. And how will they know if the vaccine is not effective? No side effects, or?
Yeah, so no side effects. You should suspect that the vaccine is not effective for you. Again, there's a reason that they say, over 90% effectiveness. That means that just under 10% of the people, it will not be effective, just because of our physiology and the way that we are as human beings. So a pretty good sign that the vaccine isn't effective for you, if you're in that 10% of people, is that you experience absolutely no side effects from either the first or the second dose. That might mean that your body is not reacting in any way to the COVID vaccine. And that might mean that you're likely still highly vulnerable to COVID. You want to try later after a different vaccine becomes available. If you tried the Pfizer, maybe try the Moderna once vaccines are widely available and you can do the vaccines again.
Do you know if there are any high expectations for other vaccine producers to get vaccines out soon, such as like Johnson and Johnson?
Yep, Johnson and Johnson is definitely on track to get a vaccine out. We have not seen its clinical trials yet, so we don't know how effective it is. If it's just as ineffective or low effectiveness as AstraZeneca. I mean, AstraZeneca is 62% effective. That is not highly effective. That's about the effectiveness of our flu vaccines, which range from 40 to 60% every year, depending, because the flu mutates very quickly. So the Johnson & Johnson, it's producing a vaccine using old methodology, so it might be only 60% effective, which wouldn't be great. Hopefully, it will be more like the Pfizer and Moderna, 60% effective. And you only need one shot of that. So that's definitely better than the hassle of getting 2 shots.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between the N95 and the KN95 mask?
There is really no difference. It's the same thing.
Okay. And how do we retain ourselves to not look at the world through cognitive bias?
So what you want to do is, for significant decisions that you want to make sure you don't screw up, that are the major decisions, you want to check for whether you have cognitive biases that are around these decisions. So you want to look at the normalcy bias, you want to look at the planning fallacy, you want to look at hyperbolic discounting. And I will send you the manual on failure proofing, which I mentioned before. So this manual on failure proofing, that's in the part of the free resources. So if you want to get that, make sure to vote for the free resources. And that manual will help you go for any major projects, obviously, like a meeting that you're planning, or maybe some internal database upgrade, or maybe hiring a major person for your team. Hiring a person for your team, you want to go for this and address any dangerous judgment errors that might be going on for you, or maybe determining your broader meeting strategy over the next few months, or years. That is the time when you want to apply these techniques and address cognitive biases by checking for them, learning about them. The book will also have that I'll send you will have a lot of information about these cognitive biases. And then, of course, through using these techniques to make sure to go through them and prepare for any problems, address threats in advance.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I have one more question. I think it's a good one. Do you think that you can get any neurological effects from the vaccination?
There is neurological. There is a 1 in 500,000 chance from the general research on vaccines that vaccines might cause a neurological reaction. So that is generally the case for vaccines overall. We don't know, we have not observed neurological reactions from the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines so far, but that it's likely to be the case that they will be in that 1 in 500,000 category that all other vaccines are. All other vaccines that contain similar chemical compounds. But the danger of getting COVID and getting sick, dying, being a long hauler is so much higher than 1 in 500,000 chance of neurological damage, so very, very much worth it to get the vaccine.
Well, Dr. Gleb, thank you so much for all the information today. It's been very informative and a wonderful presentation. We could probably stay on all afternoon asking you questions. But to come to the close of the presentation, again, thank you. We enjoyed all of the information and being updated on everything. And please be sure to complete the survey. If you have any questions, email Garland Preddy at education@sgmp.org or Emily Martin at membership@sgmp.org. Dr. Gleb, thank you so much. And everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.